Philip Simmons, Jason Carter, and Mark Delaney were three ordinary Texas husbands, devoted fathers, hard workers, and respected members of their church. But when they each discovered their wives had been secretly sleeping with the same man, their trusted pastor, Grayson Moore, they didn't turn to prayer, they turned to violence. What followed was a carefully planned act of revenge that shocked their small town and left a beloved religious leader beaten to death in the woods. This is the chilling story of betrayal, rage, and the deadly consequences of a pastor who crossed the line again and again. In the quiet, conservative town of Longview, Texas, nestled between Baptist values and Southern tradition, Pastor Grayson Moore was seen as a man chosen by God. He stood tall every Sunday behind the pulpit of New Grace Chapel, a thriving church with stained glass windows and a steeple that caught the morning light just right. To the hundreds who gathered each week, he was more than a preacher, he was a healer, a counselor, a voice of calm in an uncertain world. For the past 12 years, he had faithfully led the church, delivering sermons that seemed to speak to the soul and offering guidance that many claimed had changed their lives. Grayson knew how to command a room. His voice carried the cadence of conviction, his eyes locked with each congregant as if no one else existed in the room, and his tailored suits gave him an aura of dignity. Young couples went to him for premarital advice. Struggling parents sought his prayers for wayward children. Even people who didn't attend the church had heard of him and often stopped by just to hear him preach. What made Grayson so beloved was not just his words, but his presence. He was always at the hospital bedsides, funerals, weddings, and charity drives. He remembered names, anniversaries, and even prayer requests. He wasn't just admired, he was trusted. That trust extended deep, too deep. While the town's surface was still and calm, there were whispers starting to rise just beneath it, whispers too faint for most to catch, a look that lingered too long during a church picnic, a phone call late at night under the guise of spiritual advice, a counseling session that ran hours beyond schedule. At first, it was nothing more than gossip among a few women, quiet observations that something about Pastor Moore's behavior didn't sit right. But in towns like Longview, people protect their leaders, especially when that leader is seen as a servant of God. The rumors never found their way into the open. Not yet. Grayson's rise within the church had not been without effort. He came to Longview as a young seminary graduate, newly married, humble, and full of vision. He talked about growing the youth ministry, bringing in more families, modernizing worship. And he succeeded. Membership swelled, the church added a second service, then a third. Donations flowed in. He even became a sought-after speaker for church conferences across Texas. But with influence came temptation. Somewhere along the way, Grayson began to cross lines, small ones at first. An embrace that lasted longer than it should have, a private meeting behind locked doors, a text message that moved from spiritual to suggestive. Still, nothing was said. People loved their pastor too much to question him. He had built an image so spotless, no one dared stain it. Besides, who would believe such things about a man who quoted scripture more fluently than he spoke English? As the years passed, Grayson learned how to balance his double life. He knew when to turn on the charm and when to disappear just long enough to avoid suspicion. He offered his counseling quietly, under the radar, always with the right mix of concern and authority. For the women involved, it was more than an affair. It felt like divine intervention. He made them feel seen, special, chosen. These weren't wild, reckless women. They were wives, mothers, and church volunteers who had trusted Grayson with their hearts, their pain, and their secrets. And he used that trust to satisfy his own needs, always making them feel as if what they were doing was wrong, but somehow still right. He manipulated faith into romance, turning scripture into seduction. Outwardly, everything still looked perfect. The church bulletin had no mention of scandal, only upcoming events and scripture readings, No one asked why one woman started sitting in the back instead of the front. No one wondered why another stopped singing in the choir. They were written off as spiritual battles, not as victims of betrayal. What no one realized, what even Grayson himself didn't see, was that his web of secrets had begun to fray, and when it finally unraveled, it wouldn't just destroy his career or his marriage, it would cost him his life. Rachel Simmons had always been known as the sweet one at New Grace Chapel. A devoted mother of 2 young boys, she taught Sunday school with a warmth that made every child feel like they belonged. Her husband, Philip, worked long hours at the local factory, often picking up extra shifts to support their family. While Rachel kept a smile on her face, those closest to her knew she was lonely, often overwhelmed by the weight of doing everything on her own. It was during one of those especially hard months that she turned to Pastor Grayson Moore for counseling. She came looking for prayer and left feeling like someone had finally seen her, not just as a mother or a wife, but as a woman. What started as regular church meetings became private messages of encouragement, then long conversations about her marriage and how unappreciated she felt. Grayson was gentle, attentive, and always knew the right thing to say. Over time, those conversations turned into emotional intimacy, which then evolved into something physical. Rachel told herself it was wrong, but also that maybe God had sent Grayson to her for a reason. The guilt mixed with adrenaline, and the secrecy made everything feel more intense. Rachel wasn't alone. At nearly the same time, Angela Carter had begun seeking help from the pastor as well. Her situation was different. Her husband, Jason, was a long-haul trucker, gone for days or even weeks at a time. The silence in her house was suffocating. She started volunteering at church just to stay busy, and that's where Grayson noticed her. Angela didn't feel seen in her marriage, but with the pastor, she felt beautiful again. He praised her dedication, made time for her in ways her husband never did, and before long she found herself meeting him in the back office after Wednesday night services. Their relationship, too, crossed the line, from spiritual comfort to romantic indulgence. She never thought of herself as someone who would be unfaithful. She was raised better than that. But the attention felt like air after years of suffocating. The third woman was Michelle Delaney, the most shocking connection of all. She was the wife of Mark Delaney, one of the church's deacons. Michelle and Grayson had known each other for years. Their children played together during church picnics. To the public, she was a model church wife, elegant, quiet, and deeply involved in women's ministry. But behind the scenes, she struggled with her marriage. Mark was rigid, demanding, and cold. When she and Grayson began meeting under the pretense of ministry planning, things shifted quickly. Their affair was the most carefully hidden of all. Michelle had the most to lose, and she was deeply aware of the risks, but Grayson had a way of making her feel chosen, like their connection was different, deeper, even holy in a way. What none of the women realized at first was that they weren't alone. Each believed they were the only one. Grayson made sure of that. He was careful, calculating, always managing his lies with just enough space to avoid suspicion. But secrets don't stay buried forever. Philip Simmons, Rachel's husband, began noticing small changes in his wife. She became more distant, often stayed late at church without a real explanation. One night, when she left her phone charging in the kitchen, Philip saw a message pop up from a number saved only as G. The message read, "Thinking of you. You were amazing today." His stomach dropped. He didn't say anything, not right away. Instead, he took screenshots, backed up the message, and began quietly watching. Jason Carter, Angela's husband, had already grown suspicious months earlier. He installed a location tracker on her phone after she lied about attending a church meeting that didn't exist. When he checked the location, he saw she had spent over an hour parked outside the church long after everyone else had gone home. That same night, he found deleted call logs and browsing history. He started documenting everything. Virtually everything. Mark Delaney, the deacon, didn't suspect his wife until much later. It wasn't until he overheard a whispered phone call in the bathroom that his suspicions began. He waited until Michelle fell asleep and then went through her phone, where he discovered archived messages and photos. Some sent late at night from a number with no name, only a heart emoji as the contact label. Eventually, all three men came to the same conclusion. Grayson Moore had crossed into their homes, their marriages, and their private lives. And with each of them, he had done it with a smile and a Bible in hand. What followed wasn't rage, not at first, but a cold, quiet planning that would end in something far more brutal than betrayal. The night Pastor Grayson Moore disappeared was uneventful on the surface. A light rain had started falling over Longview around sunset, casting a gray hush across the small Texas town. By 9:00 p.m., most residents were tucked away in their homes, the streets quiet, stores closing, and the parking lot of New Grace Chapel sitting empty under the drizzle. The owner Grace the person took count as, where the reception that day had made. That evening, Grayson had told his wife he was heading to the church for a late meeting with a couple in crisis. Nothing out of the ordinary. He left wearing his usual pressed shirt, carrying his Bible under one arm, and got into his black SUV. That was the last time anyone would see him alive. The following morning, his wife reported him missing when he didn't return home or answer any calls. The police were contacted, but at first there was no sign of trouble. Grayson was a respected pastor with no known enemies. People speculated maybe he had gone on a spiritual retreat, or perhaps had taken time away to deal with stress. But all those theories were erased when, less than 24 hours later, his vehicle was found abandoned at a gas station just outside Longview. The driver's door was wide open, the keys still dangling from the ignition. His cell phone was missing, but his wallet was in the cup holder. The rain had washed away any potential footprints. There were no surveillance cameras pointed toward the part of the lot where his vehicle was found, and no gas station employees remembered seeing anything suspicious. The case quickly shifted from a possible missing person to something more sinister. Search teams scoured the nearby woods and ditches but found nothing. Rumors began to spread. Some believed he had run away, others whispered about mental health struggles, but those closest to him, especially his wife and congregation, insisted he would never leave without a word. As days passed, concern turned into fear. Prayer circles were held in the chapel. Candlelight vigils lined the front steps. Still, no sign of the beloved pastor. 2 days later, the call came in. A group of teenagers hiking through a wooded area behind an old quarry stumbled across what they first thought was a mannequin. It was a man's body, severely beaten, face swollen and unrecognizable, clothes torn and stained with blood. His hands were broken, his ribs crushed, and there were signs of blunt force trauma to the head. His ID was found in his pocket, Grayson Moore. The discovery sent shockwaves through Longview. A pastor murdered in such a violent and personal way was unheard of in their quiet community. Church members wept openly in the streets. The media swarmed in from nearby cities. As police began their investigation, they were struck by the brutal nature of the killing. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. Nothing of value had been taken. His wedding ring, wallet, and watch were all intact. This was deliberate. It was personal, and it was angry. Detectives began retracing Grayson's steps, combing through his emails, social media, and phone records. That's when inconsistencies began to emerge. There were several deleted texts and calls on his burner phone. A second device registered under a fake name, discovered inside a compartment of his SUV. The messages were romantic in nature, some flirtatious, others suggestive, and all pointed to hidden relationships. Investigators quickly identified the women Rachel Simmons, Angela Carter, and Michelle Delaney. All of them were married, all regular attendees of his church, and all had crossed personal lines with the pastor. It was a devastating revelation. The grieving community now faced the ugly truth. Their pastor had not been who they thought he was. But even more disturbing were the mounting signs that this wasn't just about adultery. As detectives interviewed the women and began pressing deeper into their lives, it became clear that the affair was only half the story. One of the women, shaken and pale, revealed that her husband had recently discovered the affair and had grown withdrawn and erratic. Another mentioned that she had stopped all contact with Grayson weeks earlier after being told by her husband that it would be taken care of. The investigators realized they were no longer looking at a random act of violence. They were staring into the heart of a calculated act of revenge. What happened in the woods that night wasn't spontaneous. It had been planned, coordinated, and executed by someone or several people who had known exactly who Grayson Moore really was, and decided that he deserved to die for it. The investigation into Pastor Grayson Moore's death intensified in the days following the discovery of his body, and as detectives sifted through the evidence, a disturbing picture began to emerge. The brutality of the murder wasn't random. The force, the precision, the rage, it all pointed to someone who knew Grayson personally. Someone with a reason. But the deeper the investigators looked, the more questions they found, especially when they began tracing his secret second phone. This burner device, hidden away in a concealed compartment in his SUV, had been carefully used. No social media apps, no contacts under real names, only encrypted messaging apps and a pattern of deleted conversations. Though some data had been wiped, enough remained to identify the women he had been involved with: Rachel Simmons, Angela Carter, and Michelle Delaney. Interviews with the women revealed layers of emotional manipulation, secrecy, and betrayal. Each of them had believed they were special, that their relationship with Grayson was unique. All three were unaware that he had been seeing the others. They also admitted, reluctantly, that their husbands had started to suspect something in recent weeks. But what struck investigators the most wasn't the women's testimonies. It was the growing signs of collusion among the husbands. Philip Simmons had become withdrawn in the days before Grayson's death. According to neighbors, he had started spending late nights in his garage, working on something no one could identify. Jason Carter, usually on the road for work, had taken an unusual break from trucking, claiming he needed time to fix things at home. And Mark Delaney, the church deacon, had abruptly canceled 2 church committee meetings, something he had never done in all his years of service. While none of these actions were incriminating by themselves, together they painted a timeline, one that coincided with Grayson's disappearance. A crucial break came when a technician from the crime lab recovered fragments of emails sent to Grayson's church account from untraceable addresses. The tone was threatening. One read, "Your time is almost up. Confess or judgment will come." Another warned, "You've destroyed too many lives. It's over." Investigators traced the origin of these messages to various public Wi-Fi networks across town, coffee shops, libraries, even a bus terminal. Someone had gone to great lengths to remain anonymous. Eventually, detectives focused on Philip Simmons, the quietest of the 3 husbands. They searched his property under a warrant and discovered a pair of boots hidden behind a stack of paint cans in his garage. The boots had traces of blood in the treads. A forensic analysis confirmed the blood matched Grayson Moore's DNA. That discovery led to a search of Jason Carter's home, where a hammer with traces of human tissue was found inside an old toolbox in the shed. Mark Delaney, ever the composed deacon, had scrubbed his garage clean with bleach, but small blood traces were still detected on a workbench. Confronted with the evidence, the pressure cracked the thin shell of silence the men had built. Philip broke first. In a long, emotionally detached confession, he admitted that the 3 of them had discovered their shared betrayal weeks earlier. Fueled by anger, shame, and a sense of humiliation, they met in secret to plan what they called an act of justice. Each man brought something to the table: tools, knowledge, a place to meet. The plan was simple: lure Grayson out under the guise of needing help, confront him, and make him pay. They had no intention of involving the police. In their minds, The justice system wouldn't understand what Grayson had taken from them: their dignity, their marriages, their trust. The night of the murder, they had met at Jason Carter's family-owned storage unit outside town. Grayson had arrived thinking he was meeting a distraught husband seeking forgiveness. What followed was a violent ambush. The beating was relentless, fueled not just by physical anger but by emotional devastation. Grayson didn't fight back. He barely had a chance to react. Once it was over, they wrapped his body in a tarp, loaded it into Jason's truck, and dumped it in the woods near the old quarry. The pact of silence was agreed upon right then. No one would talk, no one would confess. They would go home, return to their lives, and act as if nothing had happened. But secrets rarely stay buried, and under the weight of guilt and investigation, their story fell apart. The truth was now undeniable. The three men had turned from betrayed husbands into vigilantes, carrying out a punishment they believed the world would never deliver. The trial of Philip Simmons, Jason Carter, and Mark Delaney drew national attention and transformed the quiet town of Longview into a media circus. News vans lined the courthouse steps. Satellite dishes towered over the oak trees. True crime bloggers, news anchors, and curious onlookers filled the courtroom each day, eager to watch the fall of three seemingly ordinary men who had committed an extraordinary act of violence. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense and heavy. The three defendants sat in silence, each surrounded by legal teams, eyes cast downward. Their wives were present, sitting apart from one another, each woman carrying a different expression: shame, confusion, sorrow. They had once been entangled in the same secret. Now they were bound by public humiliation and broken homes. Prosecutors painted a clear picture. This was premeditated murder. The men had discovered their wives' affairs with Pastor Grayson Moore, and instead of reporting him or confronting him openly, they had taken the law into their own hands. They lured him to a secluded location, beat him with blunt objects, and left his body in the woods like garbage. Evidence was stacked in layers: blood traces on tools, DNA on clothing, deleted messages recovered from burned drives, and a confession that detailed the exact sequence of the crime. Prosecutors argued that this wasn't a moment of passion, but a calculated decision made over several weeks. The defense team pushed a different narrative. They focused on Grayson Moore's manipulation and abuse of spiritual authority. They presented the pastor not as a victim, but as a predator who used his position to prey on vulnerable women. They called character witnesses who spoke about how he had crossed boundaries, how he had destroyed families while hiding behind a pulpit. One defense attorney called it a spiritual betrayal so deep it ruptured the soul. They didn't deny the men's actions, but claimed they had snapped, crushed under emotional trauma, public shame, and private devastation. The courtroom listened in stunned silence as Rachel Simmons took the stand. Her voice trembled as she described how Grayson slowly gained her trust, then crossed the line from spiritual support to physical intimacy. She admitted she had believed it was love, but when her husband found out, everything shattered. She expressed deep remorse for the affair and told the court that while she did not condone what her husband had done, she understood the depth of his pain. Angela Carter followed. Her testimony was short and tearful. She revealed how isolated she had felt in her marriage and how Grayson's attention made her feel alive. She never imagined the consequences of her choices would end with a murder trial. She also admitted that Jason had confronted her days before the pastor's death, asking if she had ever loved him at all. She didn't answer that night. The next morning, Grayson was dead. Michelle Delaney's testimony stunned even the most experienced reporters. Calm and composed, she detailed how Grayson had initiated the relationship, framing it as something divinely orchestrated. She claimed he warned her not to tell anyone, saying that the church would never understand a love like theirs. When her husband found out, she said he didn't scream or cry, he just walked away. She had no idea what he was planning. After 3 weeks of arguments, testimony, and mounting public pressure, the jury returned its verdict. All 3 men were found guilty of second-degree murder. The judge, acknowledging the emotional weight of the case, handed down sentences ranging from 25 to 30 years. There would be no parole before 20. The courtroom was silent as the sentences were read. No one cheered. No one cried out. It was a heavy, final moment. In the months that followed, New Grace Chapel shut its doors for good. The congregation splintered. Some members left town. Others stopped going to church entirely. The building that once echoed with hymns and sermons became an empty shell, locked and quiet. Grayson Moore's name was erased from church bulletins and online sermons. The legacy he built was gone, replaced by scandal and blood. Longview moved on, but it did so cautiously, knowing that trust is not easily rebuilt. The story of Pastor Grayson Moore and the 3 husbands who killed him became a painful reminder that beneath even the most perfect surfaces, darkness can grow. And when that darkness is exposed, it doesn't just break the rules, it destroys lives.